Hey everybody, welcome back to Hints and Guesses, my podcast. Kent here, thanks for tuning in, thanks for listening. I'm excited about today. I want to continue on in my series that I'm calling Wandering Through the Bible. I wanted to start with the Christ story, certain elements of it really, and I've been in conversation with my patrons about occasionally doing some additional episodes on the Bible or related to biblical content, to the images and the symbols and the patterns that still seem to be alive, that still seem to be able to challenge and mirror back something to us. And the place that feels most alive for me at the moment is the Christ symbol. And a couple of years ago, during COVID, I made an audiobook that I made available to my patrons for free, and it just kind of lived out there wherever things live on the internet. And I don't know, so I was thinking about, all right, let's return to some biblical content. I wonder what I said in this audiobook, which I called A Grain of Wheat. So I just started listening to it again, and I thought I'd just re-release parts of it. I might even release the entire thing here over the course of time, where we'll drop in to these, what eventually, was formed in my mind as kind of these 7 stages of the life of Christ, reading through a symbolic lens. And so that's where we're going. And today's episode really is still part of the introduction of that audiobook, where I deal with the faces of Jesus, and then more concretely, how to hear these stories. Like, what does it mean to listen symbolically, and how might we do that? So that's kind of the ground I want to cover today. And you might wonder to yourself, why go back, man? Why go back to these archaic stories? And I have actually many answers to that. One of them being I think they live in the psyche. They live in the Western psyche for sure. They live in the collective field, and the collective field influences our own personal world. We don't come into the world tabula rasa. We don't come in as a blank slate. So wisdom, I think, in part, requires us to tune our ear to the ancient, to tune our ear to the old stories, to tune our ear to the great questions of humanity, of which the Bible wrestles, and Christianity wrestles, and the figure of Christ wrestles. And also, too, I don't know what's happening right now in the world when it comes to Christianity. Like, we've got Christian nationalism on the rise. We have a very left-leaning and progressive version of Christianity. We have people dismissing it altogether, lumping it in with patriarchy and power and corruption. We have much of the global South and Africa quickly converting to very charismatic expressions of the Christian faith. It's growing in other areas of the world. We also have these like public figures, the ones that I follow, and maybe others, but like Russell Brand and Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw, one of my all-time favorite storytellers, all of which have converted to Christianity just in recent years. And you think, this is weird. This is an unusual phenomenon. What the heck is happening? It reminds me of this little passage from Jung. So I wanted to read this before we get into what I call the changing faces of Jesus and the symbolic Christ, and still part of the introduction of this audiobook. So here's a line from Jung. This is in a little book I have called The Undiscovered Self. And here's the passage. This is not to say that Christianity is finished. I am, on the contrary, convinced that it is not Christianity, but our conception and interpretation of it that has become antiquated in the face of the present world situation. Now, I don't know when he wrote this, but certainly it was a while ago, and I feel the power and the truth in what he's saying, particularly when it says our version of Christianity, or the versions floating around, have become antiquated in the face of the present world situation, especially now. But I also find it surprising because Jung is he's not a fan. I don't know if that's even fair, but a fan of Christianity. At times he's a fierce critic, and he gets a lot of flack he got a lot of flack from Christian thinkers and theologians and pastors, and everything from being called a heretic to a mystic, and sort of watch out. And in fact, there's a new book out by Elia Delio called The Not Yet God. One of these days, I'm going to make a podcast about, well, in some sense, inspired from that book. But she takes Teilhard de Chardin and Jung as two of the most important thinkers for the future of Christianity. So I happen to agree with her. But let me just finish this passage. The Christian symbol is a living thing that carries in itself the seeds of further development. It can go on developing. That does scare people, obviously. It can go on developing. It depends only on us, whether we can make up our minds to meditate again and more thoroughly on the Christian premises, like the foundations, the core, the symbols I'm adding. So, in a simple sense, that's what I'm trying to do here. That's what I was trying to do in this audiobook, and to meditate again, to sit with, to contemplate, to chew on, to expose myself, to expose us more thoroughly to the foundations here, and see what's possible. See if there's not a territory we haven't yet visited. Maybe in the largest sense. I don't know if you know who Phyllis Tickle is, but I used to read a lot of her stuff. She's now passed away. My wife and I met her once. A beautiful person. Anyway, she had a claim. She was very much a historian more than anything else, a historian of religion, particularly of Christianity. And she claimed that every 500 years, Christianity would go through an upheaval. I'll add a kind of death and resurrection. I mean, think of the Reformation 500 years ago, and 500 years before that, the splitting of the East and the West, and inside Christianity, and on back you go all the way. You can keep going all the way back to the Axial Age, 500 years before the birth of Christ. So it's like a cycle, a pattern that turns itself over very slowly. And she used to say, and we're in one now. And maybe she was a little ahead of her time, because I used to listen to that and think, yeah, it seems like we're in one now. But now it seems glaringly obvious that the whole world is in a kind of turning. The great turning, really. I think that's what Joanna Macy calls it, an apocalyptic time, a revealing time where a lot of danger is present and a lot of potent opportunity. We're there. And Christianity is mixed in that conversation, in what will die and what will be reborn, or what will be blown away in the wind. What chaff will be blown away? I don't know if you know that image from the Bible, the winnowing fan, the winnowing fork. And I saw this once when I was in Morocco, where this farmer was throwing grain up in the air, and the wind was blowing away the husks, the chaff from the kernel, from the seed. There it is. Yeah, we're in that kind of age. So I hope you'll join me. I hope you'll listen. I hope you'll listen for a hint, a guess, a clue, something for your own spiritual growth and development, maybe something that will challenge you or encourage you. You never know. You never know. As Jesus says, it's like leaven. Just a little bit of leaven makes its way through the batch of dough in a kind of mysterious way. So we never know what's going to land, what's going to grab our attention and pull us in. So, yeah, thanks again for tuning in. Special thanks to my patrons. They're the ones that made this audiobook happen in the first place. And I promised in the last episode that if I made up kind of a wild number, I'm quite far from that at the moment, 200 patrons, I do an updated version, which I'd like to call the Wild Galilean, where I'd like to pick up some other even stranger dimensions of of the life of Christ through the symbolic and archetypal lens. So the Wild Galilean, and I'll make another audiobook, and I'll make it available to my patrons. So we'll see what happens. Your support really, really is helpful. The other things that are going on in my life, you can check out my website, kentdobson.com, for upcoming things. You can check out programs that I'm guiding for Animas Valley Institute, animas.org. And thanks for being a part of this. Enjoy. I think it's worth talking about the many faces of Jesus right here at the beginning. And I think with all of the best symbols that humanity has ever uncovered or dreamed up, you can say something similar. There are many faces to Buddha. There are many faces to Muhammad from a symbolic point of view. And I don't want to go through other kinds of religions or spiritualities or practices, but you get what I'm saying. The best symbols are bottomless, we could say. And so there's nothing really wrong with the fact that nobody has the corner on Jesus. It's a gift. But at the same time, I think it's worth sort of talking about how we come to think of Jesus. You'll get my point here. The first is to say something like this: the many faces of Jesus. The first face that's worth naming is a kind of Western Jesus. What I like to say is a Jesus made in our own image. This is denominational Jesus. You go into just about any church in America, and you'll get a particular Jesus that tends to look exactly like the people sitting in the pews. Sometimes it'll be even more obvious than that, and you'll see stained glass windows or paintings, and sure enough, the Jesus looks very much like the people in the pews, very much like the pastor, very much like the priest, sometimes wearing similar outfits, oftentimes with similar skin color, this kind of thing. This is Jesus in our own image. And it's actually not a bad place to start. I mean, I used to really criticize it, like, how dare we create Jesus in our own image? But another part of me says, what else are we supposed to do? Now that I know a little bit about depth psychology, that's the way projection works. You project onto the other what's in you. And part of that projection helps us grow up if we can begin to own it. We can begin to say, I realize what I'm putting on Jesus here. And suddenly, not only does my own understanding of Jesus expand, but my own understanding of who I am begins to expand. So it's not a terrible place to start. But I think it probably would do, especially Western American culture, a lot of good to say, the Jesus I'm worshiping oftentimes is just a kind of exaggerated image of myself. That's kind of humbling. So that's the first Jesus worth mentioning. The second one I would like to call the global Jesus. And it's just a way of expanding out on point number one, that if you go around the world, you discover, this phenomenon happens all over the place. Sure enough, Russian Orthodox Jesus looks a lot like other Russian Orthodox Christians. And that was one thing I just absolutely loved about living in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is a place where, it's a magnet for the many Christianities and denominations that are out there, and they all bring with them their Jesus to this place. Not only the tourists, but even the denominations and expressions of Christianity that are housed there, like the Armenians and the Ethiopians and the Coptics and the Catholics and the Catholics from Eastern Europe and the Catholics and the Franciscans and and on and on and on and on it goes. And you realize, it's actually kind of amazing to see that a poor peasant from Galilee who spoke Aramaic and Hebrew and probably didn't even know Greek, that this figure from a certain place in history went global. It's unbelievable. that the symbol can be translated into so many languages and tongues. But it's worth saying there's a global Christ, and it's very regional. So we all tend to create Jesus in our own image. The third thing that is worth pointing out here is going back in time a bit, which is Christ as emperor. This started already in books like Revelation and some of the writings of Paul and a bit of the Gospel of Mark, where they're playing with Jesus as Caesar. And they're doing that in part because they're trying to confront the empire with the gospel story, the story of Jesus. But what happens to Christianity, which that could be a whole audio book in and of itself, and others would be better at it than me, but by the time post-Constantine that Christianity becomes the official religion of Rome, suddenly Christ is the emperor. He's not a barefooted Galilean peasant, charismatic, healing, wandering, storytelling, prophet-like figure. He's a king. He's an emperor. This is the institutionalization of Christianity. And that's one of the things, for better or worse, that helps it spread around the world, because power and empire and Christ begin to hold hands. And it's kind of amazing that the peasant who was crucified somehow becomes an emperor. And this was done in some ways consciously by the church. And it's one of the Christs. It's one of the Christs. And it's worth noting, okay, sometimes we have turned Christ into the emperor. Going back before that, we have what's called the historical Jesus. And this took up much of my time and energy and graduate work. And the reason why I moved to Israel was in pursuit of, in question of, the historical Jesus. Well, what's behind the Jesus in our own image and the global Christs and the Christ as emperor, institutional Christ? What's behind that must be the historical Jesus. And if I could just get to the bottom of the well, I would discover the truth. Even though I'm clearly Generation X person, raised in postmodern kind of linguistic, what would we say? A word like truth makes us uncomfortable. I was still looking for it anyway. Even if I think it doesn't exist, I want to go all the way down to the bottom and try to find the historical figure. By the way, I think this is a fantastic and great gift to the evolution of Christ and even of Christ consciousness. Bringing in the historical Jesus suddenly confronted Christ as emperor and confronted the global Christs that are out there. And if we'll let it, confront the Jesus in our own image. The one on Sunday morning that we're singing songs about, the historical Jesus will confront. Suddenly you realize he's a Jew. He didn't even share my own religion. He's far more enigmatic and provocative and prophetic and dangerous and wild than I ever thought possible. And so a confrontation with the historical Jesus has done a great service to Christianity, and it's changing institutional Christianity. Now people will even admit, oh yeah, Jesus was a Jew. The Catholic Church, post-Vatican II, changed its mind on fundamental teachings that were anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish. Almost, I would say, almost directly a result of discovering the historical Jesus, thanks to good scholars. Amazing. Now, from my own point of view, I thought that's kind of where it's going to end for me, the historical Jesus. I'm going to either get there and say, now I found it, or I'm going to get there and say, it can't be found, and the quest is over. It's like in Monty Python, they spend all this time trying to go to Camelot, and then they say, oh, Camelot, it's a silly place. Let's not go there. Let's go somewhere else. That's kind of what I thought might happen. However, just in terms of my own personal story, what was happening to me in this quest for the historical Jesus and the going through the weeds of the Christs of church history, what happened to me was not just intellectual, like an academic exercise, but something far more existential. And the very fabric of my own faith, my own longings, my own desires, my own confusion was being stretched and in some cases torn. And I'd try to patch it back up together, or, whatever kind of language might work for you. It was highly personal and existential. And I started to really, really long for not the intellectual abstract truth, but contact with the divine, with the mystery, with the abyss. And I told myself, I'm willing to take all kinds of social risks, like what if people think I'm not a Christian or whatever, in pursuit of this. I want to follow it where it goes. It's like there's something provocative about this line in the Gospels. It says, the Spirit led Jesus out into the wilderness. The Spirit led Jesus out into the wilderness. The mystery of God led Jesus out into the wilderness. And I would say something like that was happening in my own life. The wind, the mystery was leading me not to the promised land, but into the wilderness. Into the stark, the stark vastness, the empty plain, to quote Rilke. Go out into your heart as onto a vast plain, and there the immense loneliness begins. That was happening just in my own life, in my own pursuit of the many Jesuses, and trying to understand the faces of Jesus. And what started happening kind of slowly is, first of all, I started to be introduced to the mystical Jesus. And the mystical Jesus is kind of like an undercurrent that, almost despite the Jesus in our own image and the global Christs and the Christ as emperor and the historical Jesus, the spirit of Christ, or even Christ consciousness, transcends and includes all of those things. And the great mystics of Christianity, which I started to first bump into in graduate class and also through the teachings of Richard Rohr, were saying something like, Jesus is not to be believed in necessarily, but can be encountered in a wildly personal way, and sometimes in very dangerous and provocative ways, the mystical Jesus, and can transform your life. And one can have a relationship with the mystery of the divine. This is the mystical Christ. And we could even take it a little further with the Celts, and they weren't the only ones saying this, so were certain church fathers as well, that this same Christ, this same mystical Christ, the mystery of the divine, is in all things, and is in the clover, and the sun, and the moon, and the landscape. This is St. Francis seeing the divine in all things. In all expressions of nature is the hidden Christ mystery. This is probably why Richard Rohr calls it the universal Christ, which transcends and includes all of our many Jesuses. This is the Christianity at its most mystical, and really, surprisingly, although it sounds like too deep, that's the way people treat mysticism, it's so deep, it's actually saying the opposite. It's saying it can be encountered. It's accessible. It's not elitist and for those sitting on a mountain, and it actually can be encountered in all kinds of surprising ways. That's the mystical Christ. Now, I'm adding something here, which in many respects is related to what I'm calling the mystical Christ, and that is the symbolic Christ. This is the sixth face of Jesus. And that's the one I want to kind of hover around the rest of the book, the symbolic Christ. You could even say the archetypal Christ, that even behind the specific Christ mystery, the mystical Christ mystery or Christ consciousness, is an archetype, a pattern of truth, a constellation which creates a pattern, a constellation of energies which creates a pattern. Like when you look up at the sky and all of a sudden you notice that this seemingly random assortment of stars is making a bow. and the arrow is about to run through the heart of a deer. It's like there's a pattern there. And once it gets activated, it has a certain kind of power, a certain kind of resonance that transcends any sense of history or time. It's eternal. That's the way it feels. That's the way the archetype is encountered. That's the power of the symbol itself. Again, to go back to Jung, let me look at the quote here. It was, the symbol is the best possible expression for a complex fact not yet clearly apprehended by consciousness. And what I'd like to suggest, as humbly as I can, is that there's still more to this Jesus symbol that's yet to be clearly apprehended by consciousness. Or to put it more directly, still has the power to continue to transform and shape human consciousness, which we need now more than ever. Our human consciousness, if it is not transformed, will end up in a kind of collective suicide when it comes to the planet, or a genocide when it comes to our neighbors. Nothing short of the transformation of consciousess, which has been ongoing and unfolding, not only inside religions and spiritualities, but inside Christianity. Christianity itself evolves, and anyone, even the great church teachers of doctrine admit such a thing, that the Spirit of God continues to work. The wind of God continues to lead us out into the desert where we die, where we're buried, where the seed goes into the ground so that something else can be born in its place. And we're at that kind of place globally right now with the virus and with climate change and with the disruption of cultures and religions and belief systems and ideologies. We're on shaky ground. And that kind of shaky ground is the sort of liminal threshold where transformation is possible, where something like the Christ symbol can confront us again. The reason why I like saying Christ symbol, and you might disagree or have a different name for it or might not even resonate with it, is that I want to say the symbol transcends the religion born in its name. And in fact, that's part of why I still think it has power. Jung did say that even the best symbols can lose their power, and they either get absorbed by the next kind of religious or spiritual or even ideology, or they morph or change, or they just disappear. And you could easily say maybe that's happening to Christianity. And I say I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure when it comes to the symbol of Christ, because I would like to suggest one reason why we have to face again the person of Jesus, and is that it's part of Western consciousness. Christianity is part of Western consciousness, like it or not. It has fueled everything from slavery to the abolition of slavery, to manifest destiny, to asking forgiveness from the Native American population that we decimated as white Western conquerors. So all of that was part of what we might call a Christian worldview. So Christ somewhere can't just be simply gotten over and like, hey, we're just going to listen to science and Richard Dawkins and do away with all this superstition. It doesn't work that way because it rests in the collective field. And therefore, it needs our attention. And also, I might say something more about the Christ symbol. It rests in the personal and collective unconscious, the symbol of death and resurrection, the certain kind of constellation, the grain of wheat. One part of us, it's like rings a tuning fork, and we know it's true, that if we want to be transformed, we must die and be reborn. And the tuning fork is rung. Or as Jesus says, we must be born again, which is his way of putting it. Boom, the tuning fork is rung. And we know that. We know that. We know that human beings do not transform easily. And the death of our ego is exactly that. It's a death. It's a blow. And of course, I'm not here to say it's the only symbol that needs our attention. There are others. That's why I love Thomas Merton. He was trying to have a conversation between the East and the West, saying the best part of the East can meet the best part of the West and continue to help transform our consciousness. That's why we should be reading Zen Buddhist texts and the mystical texts of Christianity, and they're not exactly saying the same thing all the time, but they're coming from the same ground, and that ground is an acknowledgement that only death and resurrection will do when it comes to transformation. So I hope you're tracking with me. I wanted to give you a sense of the faces of Jesus that are involved. And sometimes it's helpful just to parse them out. Wait, what Jesus are we talking about here? And then to sort of introduce us to the idea that beneath that is the symbol of Christ itself, which transcends what we might call Christianity. The other thing that I might want to say by way of introduction is to say something about how to read the stories themselves. And I'm not going to do a lot of reading of the stories. I'm going to talk about the stories, and maybe I'll read a few passages. So if you want more, go directly to the text itself. Read the Gospels. Why not? Read them now at the age and stage of life that you're in, and see what you hear, see what you resonate with, see what bothers you, and see what rings your bell, and see what gets under your skin. You know, all that stuff is worth paying attention to in the process of transformation. So I think it's worth saying that when we approach an ancient text like the scriptures, a sort of mytho-poetic, archetypally rich, symbolic story, how do we do it? What must we keep in mind? And for a while I've been saying, and I put this on my podcast a while back, that there are three chords, three strands that make up like a braid or something. The first is story. It's always a good idea to say what story is being told here. You know, that's why I never really like many sermons, because they tend to take a verse or even a word in a verse and use that as a springboard to talk about something else with no story in sight. You know, what's the story? Fundamentally, the texts are stories. I don't even care what kind of text it is, if it's a Pauline letter, if it's a gospel, or if it's a prophetic text from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible. It's still important to say, what's the story? What's the story? Who are the characters, and what's the arc here, and where's the literary tension? And, you know, that's kind of, you know, sounds sophisticated, but I just mean it in a more simple sense. What story is being told? And what do I sense is the story? And where do I find myself in the story? That's one of the most interesting questions I think one can ask. What characters do I resonate with? Take the prodigal son. You know, am I the son that ran away? Am I the son that stayed home and was a good little boy but embittered? Or am I the father in the story? You know, or am I the pigs that are hungry for something? That's the way a great story can be listened to. The next chord is context, and that's in some parts that's how I made a living for a while, talking about context, and it's a big part of even the conversation I have on my Israel trips, and it's why I wrote the NIV First Century Study Bible, why I wrote the notes and the articles in there, because I care about context. It's one of the chords, and context helps situate these stories somewhere, in a context, in a place, in a language, in a culture. It's not exactly it's scientifically oriented, meaning scholarship is involved and there are certain rules to the game, but context it's only one lens, and it has its limitations, but it's important. It's what's behind the quest for the historical Jesus. Who was this person in the flesh? Definitely worth asking. And the third chord is the symbolic. It's the archetypal, the metaphoric, the image, the energetic image that rings behind the story. And all three matter. I'm a little more interested in the symbolic nature of things and how it might point to universal patterns and truths, and how it might confront our consciousness, and how it might challenge our ego. And that's all what the best stories and symbols do. So, what have I said so far here in the introduction? I've said, hey, keep in mind when we're talking about Jesus, there are at least 6 faces we can talk about. And when we're talking about these stories, there are at least 3 chords that are worth naming, the story and the context, but then there's the symbol itself. the best symbols and the big symbols are transcendent and have a certain energetic quality to them, are archetypal, and they provoke and challenge and wake something within us. And still, if archetype sounds kind of too obscure for you, let me just give you some like typical archetypes: mother, father, husband, wife, masculine, feminine, yin and yang, child, warrior, king, queen, healer, magician, dragon, tyrant, hunter, farmer, grain of wheat, cross, the garden, the manger, the star in the east. Now I'm naming, of course, images and patterns in the Gospels, but that have a certain archetypal quality to them and a certain symbolic resonance. And the question is, to a certain extent, what does the constellation of the Christ symbol include? Think about the stars and the kind of random assortment of stars above, and somehow there's a constellation that we're calling the symbolic Christ. And each of those individual stars has a certain kind of light, a certain kind of energy, and a certain kind of power. And it feeds the image in some mysterious way. And the way that the constellation comes together in the Christ symbol, what kind of power is present? And how might that power help activate something within us? That's the kind of thing I'm dancing around here and exposing myself to in my own way. As much as I try at times to get away from Jesus, one can't get away from the stars in the sky. One can't get away from the big symbols and the big archetypes. And if it's not the Christ symbol for you, it might be something else, hidden in the shadows or hidden in plain sight. And exactly what it is will probably surprise you. So, I think that's a good enough introduction. Could be better, I'm sure, but a good enough introduction. And it's probably time to now talk about these 7 stages. Maybe even these 7 stages are like one of each stage is a star that creates a certain kind of pattern, which I will only, at my very best, even if I do the very best job I can, I am scratching the surface. I am simply pointing to something. That's it.